G'day comrades, welcome to the Mind in 1500 Words, Season 3, Episode 5, Madden, Waxman, Woodring, and Wishinawatok. 2010, Human-centeredness is not a universal feature of young children's reasoning. Culture and experience matter when reasoning about biological entities. In Cognitive Development, Volume 25, Issue 3, page 197 to 207. Thanks to everyone for your patience through what's been a more than slightly absurd September and October for us. I'm glad to be back, and would like to offer my thanks to everyone who gave the show a go whilst I've been away. I have plans moving forward for some new content for you, focused more in my research area, which I hope will be of interest to some of you. As always, what's produced is driven by my health more than anything. If you are enjoying the show, or finding it occasionally helpful, please do share it around or consider leaving a review. Both help new people find it. This week, we're continuing our look at cognitive development. One of the topics you'll come across here is the question of domain specificity of the development of thinking about particular topics. Last time out, we touched on the idea from Piaget that our cognitive capacities develop in stages. As this project developed, people began asking questions about whether these stages progress uniformly across all things we can think about, call this the domain general approach, or whether different kinds of thinking develop somewhat independently, call this the domain specific approach. The domain specific approach has its origins in Chomsky's work on the development of language, and has been influential in the study of how we think about not just language, but each other. For example, perspective taking and theory of mind, the physics of how things move, and biology, amongst other things. Once researchers started asking questions about particular domains, they started looking in detail at the development of thought about particular topics. The paper I've chosen for today is on this latter topic, the development of how we think about biological categories. Madden and colleagues are interested in the inferences children draw based on biological categories. They point to previous research, starting with Carey in the 1980s, that kicked off a debate as to whether children treat human as the basic biological kind. So there's a new concept for us. What do we mean if we say something is the base of its kind? Base for what? Well, base for inferences. No one is saying that kids think dogs are made of humans or anything like that. Rather that they're understood by how similar they are to humans. The proposal is that kids' prototypical example of something that is alive is human, and that all other living things are understood by how similar they are to humans. So we're seeing here the idea, which you may have come across elsewhere, that intuitive inferences are based on similarity to a prototype or exemplar at work. Specifically, applied to biological categories. If human is understood as the base prototype or example of something living, then kids should draw inferences about living things based on their perceived similarity to humans. How might we test this? One way, started by Carey, was to make up a biological property and tell kids that a kind of animal has it. Carey invented a property and called it omentum, which sounds vaguely sciencey, so it seems to the kids that they're being taught something. One assumes that at the end of the experiment, kids are told that this is fiction. You don't want them to end up thinking omentum causes autism or anything. Anyway, kids are told that humans, dogs, or bees have this purported property of omentum. Later, sometimes days later, they are asked to find other animals that have this property. If humans are the base of the category of living things, then we'd expect that more animals would be attributed omentum by those kids who were taught humans had this property than those who were taught that dogs or bees had it. If humans are the prototype of life, then living things will be overall more likely to share features of humans than other animals. Carey found that 4-year-old kids attributed omentum to more animals if they were taught humans had it than if they were taught dogs or bees had it. Similarly, for any selected animal, they were more likely to attribute it to that animal if they were taught humans had it than attribute it to humans if they were taught the animal had it. E.g., Kids who were taught humans had omentum were more likely to say dogs had it than kids who were taught dogs had it were to say humans had it. Older kids and adults didn't show this pattern, instead following a pattern of intuitive similarity to a more narrowly defined types. Roughly, if dogs or humans had omentum, they tended to attribute it to other mammals. If bees had it, then it was attributed to other insects. That's only rough, but what we're seeing is that 4-year-olds' inferences suggest they treat human as the base category of all living things, but older kids and adults don't. Okay, that sounds pretty cool, but research since Carey's initial paper has been pretty ambiguous. Sometimes these effects are found, and sometimes they're not. Maybe they're false positives when they're found, and 4-year-olds don't use human as the base of the category of living things. Medden and colleagues propose an alternative explanation, however. They suggest that whether or not 4-year-olds use human as the base of the category of living things depends on kids' experiences with other animals and the cultural importance of those animals. Kids with more experience with animals, especially those deemed important by their carers, might have a different or broader base to their concept of living things than kids with a narrower range of experiences. To test this idea, Medden and colleagues looked at the inferences drawn by kids from 3 cultural groups within the US. These were urban kids in the US of European descent, rural kids in the US of European descent, and rural kids of the Menominee Nation, which is now around 234,000 acres bordered on all sides by the US state of Wisconsin. Medden and colleagues expected that urban kids would have less direct contact with animals than either of the rural groups, and much less contact with wild animals. They also note that there are different concepts of life at play. Roughly, we might say that urban and rural kids of European descent tend to understand life more narrowly than the biological notion of life, limited mostly to plants and animals, though maybe including fungi as pseudoplants. On the other hand, the Menominee have a notion that is broader than the biological, including, for example, water. There are also 5 clans within the Menominee Nation, each identified with a particular totem: bear, wolf, crane, eagle, or moose. And in their dominant creation story, humans are descended from bears. Medden and colleagues didn't provide direct measures of contact with or importance of different animals to individual children, instead treating each of their 3 groups as bringing different concepts of living things drawn from these broad cultural differences. Medden and colleagues tested kids at 3 age ranges from each of these groups. These were 4 or 5-year-olds, 6 or 7-year-olds, and 9 or 10-year-olds. Kids were tested over 2 days. On the first day, they were taught that either humans or dogs had the property omentum. Basically, they pointed to a part of a picture and named it omentum. The second day, they were shown other things: 8 vertebrates, 2 invertebrates, 2 plants, 2 natural non-living things, and 2 artifacts, and asked for each of these, does it have omentum? Were there any differences between these groups? There are, though the patterns aren't simple, so I'll pick out some of the more interesting, by which I mean confusing, findings. If different experiences with animals matter for whether or not human forms the basis of the concept of life, then we'd expect differences between the urban and the rural kids. But what exactly? Well, the first measure Medden and colleagues use is the proportion of vertebrates attributed omentum by the kids in different conditions. This could vary by age group, population, and whether the kids were taught humans or dogs had omentum. They analysed this with a technique called an ANOVA, which looked for differences in the mean proportion of vertebrates attributed omentum for each of these variables. Although rural and urban kids in the 4 or 5 years age group of European descent weren't different in this measure when taught omentum, they were when they were taught dogs had it. Specifically, urban kids attributed omentum to other vertebrates less often than rural kids when taught it was a property of dogs. This changed for the 9 or 10-year-old group. At this age, Medden and colleagues found more attributions of omentum for those taught it was a property of dogs, regardless of which of these two groups they came from. So, this fits with Medin and colleagues' idea that young city kids will treat humans as their inductive base, as the prototypical life form, perhaps because of limited experience with non-domestic animals. The other measure they used was what they called asymmetry. This was whether kids were more likely to generalize the presence of momentum from humans to dogs or from dogs to humans. This is also where things start to get less clear. For the 9 or 10-year-olds of European descent, there was no asymmetry here, regardless of whether they were from urban or rural locations. That's fine. Older kids look like they have a more general inductive base anyway. For the 4 or 5-year-olds and the 6 or 7-year-old groups, there was strong evidence of asymmetry, with kids more likely to generalize from human to dog than dog to human. This was independent of whether the kids were from a city or country location. So unlike the above, there is evidence here that 4 and 5-year-olds from a country location favour humans as their inductive base. Tensions between findings remain when we compare rural kids of European descent to Menominee children. For the 4 or 5-year-old group, rural European American kids were more likely to attribute momentum to other animals when taught it was a property of dogs than were Menominee kids. But there was no difference in the proportion of attributions when humans were said to have momentum. However, when we turn to asymmetry, there are no identifiable differences between these groups, which is confusing because when we consider the 4 or 5-year-old Menominee kids on their own, they show no evidence of asymmetry effects, whereas rural European American kids do at this age. These conflicting numbers suggest that maybe the sample sizes weren't large enough to consistently detect potential effects. This is picking out just some of the analyses run, but what we're seeing here is that sometimes there are cultural group differences on one measure, proportion of animals attributed momentum, but not on the other, asymmetry. Medin and colleagues of course point out that they've shown a dissociation between the measures and that they must measure different things, which is good, but now for us who started thinking that both could give evidence of whether or not human is treated as the prototypical life form at different ages, we are just left confused about what is measured by these tasks. Which is a shame, because there were also some really interesting findings. For example, 4 or 5-year-old Menominee children were much more likely to generalize from humans to bears than either of the European American groups. But, given some conflicting results, it's hard to interpret any of these. Such is stats. 1991.